In this video, you're going to learn everything you need to know about the analysis point on the AP US History DBQ rubric. And to help, we brought in AP US History experts Chris Averill and Paul Faeh. Now, the experts are going to break down the easiest way to get the analysis point, as well as common mistakes to avoid. So keep watching.
With the analysis point, what they're trying to attempt to do or have you show on the DBQ is analyzing the documents for themselves. You've already analyzed them for the content to support the argument, but now can you kind of qualify that document or bring up things about that document that might be relevant or significant in influencing what is being said in that document? The biggest takeaway about the analysis point and what we're hoping to achieve is that you must consider sources and what is going on with them when trying to analyze and understand history. That just because you read something, you don't just take it as that is actual fact, that is the pure story, there's nothing else to consider. For example, they give you 4 categories or 4 ways you could possibly do that. Many teachers use acronyms to try and remember those, like HIP or HAP, but the 4 ways are historical context, intended audience, purpose, and point of view. So historical context, this can be confusing because you have a contextualization point and now they're telling you about historical context. Some try to frame it or have students understand it as there is big C and little c. Big C is that contextualization point, its own individual point, and you're trying to connect the main argument as we've talked about. Historical context, some refer to it as little c, meaning what is the context, what is happening at the time of this document that might be influencing it. So it's more directed specifically towards that document rather than the big theme of the whole essay.
The intended audience would be the people that a document or perspective is hoping to influence. And so a student could present this in reference to attempting to persuade a certain group of people to do a certain thing. So that gives the intended audience plus what the significance is, what it is that they want to do. So for example, if Frederick Douglass is speaking before a crowd in the 1840s, it might sound like Douglass is attempting to influence the northern populace to support the emancipation of slaves. The purpose of the document is the intended motivation or action that an author is hoping that will take place as a result of their words in the document. The point of view is probably the most difficult one for the students to accomplish because the point of view tends to be the larger group that the perspective of the document represents and what that group's hopes are. So the point of view, it tends to be the connection between the author's perspective and a larger group that is out there and pushing an agenda.
So the point of view, representing who they are, or what their belief system might be, or what their profession might be, or what their job. When you see that in the source line, it's kind of giving you a clue that that might be significant or influential, as to what they're saying and might have an influence. To get the point with HIP, what you want to do when applying this and what it's talking about in the rubric and what they're telling you is how is this really relevant or significant to the content of the document. So you want to make some type of connection between the type of HIP you're doing and how that is significant, influential, relevant to what is being said in the argument.
So the tips I give my students relative to this difficult skill known as HIP are the following. 1, when they hit a document, can they state what caused that document, that perspective to be made? If they can, that's the historical context. If they can't, they move on to the following. Can they state the author's purpose, what action they're attempting someone someplace to take? And so if I establish purpose, it's got to be a verb. The purpose is not the perspective of the document that students commonly misalign it with. The purpose is, what is the author's purpose as to an action that needs to be taken? That's 2. If I can figure out what the audience is, I tell my students, then go ahead and determine what they want that audience to do. The last but not least, the point of view tends to be the hardest because they tend not to establish the significance of that point of view. They tend to identify the group accurately, but they don't do anything with it. And that's why students most commonly find this the most difficult. So if they have the group that the perspective of the document is in fact representing, they need to explain why that opinion is significant. For example, if this is a union leader, then the student might maintain that this person, this author, is in fact establishing union movement's beliefs, which they've always pushed for, such as reform in labor conditions. So they're establishing the significance when they establish the point of view.
The most common mistakes we see when students are attempting to get the analysis point, they feel by just using the words from HIP, like saying after they've written about the document, they'll say the purpose of the document is, and feel that because they said the word purpose, they are now covering that point. And so just by saying the intended audience or the purpose or point of view does not automatically mean then you get that point. The common mistake becomes they're just repeating the content of the document. And so this is a common mistake. What you really want to make sure of when you're working with HIP is that you're not just repeating the content or argument that you are making with evidence, because that's the evidence point and use of document. And so now the key is to analyze the document itself and how one of these strategies of HIP is influencing and giving insight to what you might be getting this document, or why the content is saying this, or where this content is coming from.
To make it clear to the reader in an attempt to get the HIP point, they have to have a clear understanding of what each of these 4 elements are. If a student is establishing the background of a document, what caused this document, we would read that as the historical context. If this student uses phraseology like, this is an attempt to influence and then fill in the blank for an audience, and then explain what they're trying to do to get those people to do, then that would be the audience. If it is the author's purpose, it tends to have a verb like to motivate, to incite, to push for some action. And for point of view, it tends to be an association with a larger group, but what is the characteristic of that larger group? So if it was Frederick Douglass, he's a member of the abolitionists who, in fact, are pushing to emancipate the slaves. That's the significance part. And that's the key to all 4 of these. It's not just the identification of it. It also has to have a significance, like Paul already established, as to a connection. Simply saying that Frederick Douglass, a black abolitionist, stated doesn't get you the point of view point, because it identifies the group, but not why that group is significant. A good example of HIP can be seen in sample A. In paragraph 3, sentence 3, it says, the Albany Plan proposed by Ben Franklin and others would have created an intercolonial assembly that would have power over intercolonial trade. That is the historical context for document 1, because then the student goes on to use the content of the document. In the next sentence, Franklin attempted to get them to join with his famous veiled threat that if they didn't join in this effort, they would all die a divided death. And that's the content use. So the first sentence dealt with the historical context with the Albany Plan. It sets up document 1, which is the divided snake. An example of purpose for HIP can be seen in paragraph 5 at the very bottom for using document 6. 2 lines up from the bottom, it says, the one piece of propaganda that was intended to convince all colonies, and there is the purpose. That phrase, intended to convince all colonies of these very simple yet clearly tyrannical actions so that they would support the revolution. So it has, the purpose is to get the colonists to support the revolution. And that is the intended purpose for Paine's common sense.